How's it going, guys? Caleb Wisted here. I'm just about to hook my boat up and go do some fishing, but before I do that, I have to spool up a brand new reel with some braided line. I've learned a lot of tips and tricks over the years on how to make this process go smoothly so that I end up with a good result when I head out fishing. So I'm going to teach you all those tips and tricks right now, eliminate all the problems that I had to go through when I was first learning how to spool up a rod with braid. So let's head to the shop and I'll show you how to do it. All right, guys, so here's the basics for what you're gonna need. You're gonna need a good pair of scissors, you're gonna need the braid, and you're gonna need some kind of monofilament for a backer. And the reason you need this monofilament for a backer, or basically to go directly to the reel, is on these reels, there really isn't much for that braid to stick to. And it being such a slick line, if you just tie the braid directly to this spool, close the bail, fill it up, that entire spool of braid can actually start spinning on the spool, and then it's completely useless. You can't use it at that point, and you have to tear it all off and start over. So I like to put monofilament onto the reel first because it grips the spool much tighter and it's not going to slip on you. Now the second reason that I like to put mono backer on here is I don't use as much braid. Braid is so thin that you can get plenty of braid for fishing with onto your spool and still have a ton of spool left over. So you don't want to necessarily spend so much money filling up your entire spool with braid if you don't have to, because it's much more expensive than mono. So I'm going to fill up the spool far enough that I know I can just get 150 yards of braid on this spool, and that's going to be more than enough. And then I don't need to waste, buying a 300-yard spool and getting it partially empty and having to throw half of it away. So I'll show you how to do all that here, but just so you know, that's what the backer is for. So how the heck do you know how much backer to put on to get your braid exactly right? Well, every spool has designations on it for how much line is going to fit on that spool. This particular one, I can see 12-pound nylon line or monofilament. It can fit 220 yards. And I can also see on this one in particular that 0.18 millimeter braid, it will fit 300 yards. Now I have 150 yards here of 0.19 millimeter braid. So I know if I put all this braid on this spool, it's basically only going to fill it halfway. So I can either eyeball halfway with the backer, or I can read this and I can put 12-pound mono on here, and I know it's going to fit 220 yards of the mono, and I can put roughly 110 yards of mono on here, and I know that's going to basically cover the backer that I need, so that when I put that 150 yards of braid on, it fills all the way out to the edge of the spool. The reason you want it to come all the way to the edge of the spool is it's going to cast much better and much further if that braid is only about a 1/16 of an inch from the lip of that spool. So we want it as far out as we can get it, and we don't want to run short. So basically what I'm going to do in this case is I'm going to eyeball. There's actually like some lines on the inside of the spool here. I can see about where halfway is, and I'm just going to eyeball halfway with the backer, and I'm going to tie that on here and fill it up about halfway, and then I know my braid should be pretty much dead on. All right, so I'm going to use 12-pound Suffix, just regular monofilament for this. And one thing you always want to remember to do is to put it through the first guide of your rod. It's much more difficult to spool this up if you don't have it through at least that first guide. So I'm going to spool it up, get this spool going through my first guide here, just like so. And now I'm going to tie just a double overhand knot in my monofilament. Basically it's just overhand knot and another overhand knot, and we're going to tighten those down on the spool nice and tight. Make sure you open that bail before you do this, or you're going to have to cut it out and do it again. I'm going to cut that tag really short, and now I'm ready to wind that monofilament down here. Now I'll show you what I've got rigged up for basically a spool holder slash tensioner that I designed here. It's right behind me. So basically how this works is I've got a little rubber gasket and a washer and a thumb screw, and then I've got this same setup here, but it's on a spring. So all I have to do is pop that spool on there. Every spool comes with a hole in the middle. And now all I gotta do is screw this thumb screw on, put a little tension on it, tighten that baby down, and now my spool has a nice tension on it for filling up the the line. So I'm gonna go ahead and spool this mono up about halfway now. All right, as you can see now, I've got about half of the spool filled with that monofilament, and now I'm just gonna cut the line and tie on my braid. All right guys, so I've got my spool out here. I'm gonna pull off a little bit of line of that braid, and I'm gonna take my monofilament in my other hand, and I'm gonna tie a uni to uni knot. And it doesn't have to be a super strong knot. It's not gonna be a factor when you're fighting a fish, because hopefully it's buried back enough in the spool that you never have to deal with fighting a fish and hitting that knot. So I'm going to tighten up the mono side. You may already know how to tie this knot, and I don't want to bore you with the steps. Basically, that's our knot. It's a uni to uni. I'm going to tighten that up, trim the tags, and then we'll keep reeling. So one of the nice things about this tensioner, guys, is I don't have to hold my finger on here to keep tension on this line as it fills up the spool. Because what happens if you don't keep tension on it, this will pile on here really loosely, and you'll end up sinking this line in when you catch a fish or hook up on a snag, and it'll dig into that spool. So you want it nice and tight on here, and that's one of the things that this does for me. Now, this little tensioner I built myself, which you can certainly do, but there's some good other tension devices out there, and I'll leave links for a couple in the description. But let's keep filling this up. We're almost done here. All right guys, I can see I'm about a 1/16 of an inch from the edge of the top of this spool, and I don't want to overfill this spool because I know wind knots are much easier to get when you're overfilling your spool. Now I can also see the spool here showing up through the braid, so I know I'm almost to the end, but I still don't want to overfill it, so I'm going to snip it here. And I know I don't have a ton of waste because, as I said, there's only maybe 10 or 15 yards left of line on that spool. So I pretty much nailed it. I did a little bit more mono than I needed to get this whole spool on here, but not by much. So that measuring technique worked out pretty dang well. Now, one other thing you can do if you don't have a line filling tensioning device is you can just grab like a rag or some kind of paper towel and kind of grip that line with it. That way you aren't going to burn your fingers as you're reeling through and keeping tension on that line to fill up your spool. All right guys, now all I have to do is thread through the rest of my guides here, and we are back in business. So now I've got a rod all set up with braid, and this is going to cast awesome. It's going to be perfect for what I need it for, and all I really need to do now is add a leader to the end of this line to do whatever I want it to do. So it could be a 15-pound leader for a heavier swim bait, or it could be a 6-pound leader for fishing a drop shot rig. But the nice thing about braid is you can oversize it a little bit and still be able to downsize for a finesse presentation if you want to use it on that particular rod. Well, I hope that video helped you out, and hopefully you learned a few things. If you did, make sure you like this video and subscribe to the channel, because there's a lot more videos like this one on there and plenty more to come. So I'm going to get this boat in the water, and hopefully I can catch a few fish on that new rod and reel I just set up. And hopefully you can get out soon too. We'll catch you later. Get hooked up.